What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological goodness, interviews with scholars across the disciplines, so you can think, reflect, wrestle, and brew your own faith, because guess what we don't need? None of that light beer religion. No, we want it flavorful. We want it zesty. And, can't be honest, Marjorie Suchocki is one of my favorite theologians of all time, a process feminist theologian. And she is kicking it into her 90s, still thinking, reflecting, challenging, provoking. She has a brand new book, 21 Psalms for the 21st Century, meditations on the Psalms that she wrote during lockdown. But she also has one of the greatest intro to process theology books, God, Christ, Church, one of the most beautiful eschatology texts, The End of Evil, my favorite text on anthropology, The Challenge of Violent Sin, and it's called The Fall to Violence. She has a beautiful tome on being a deep Christian and benefiting from a divinity of diversity called Divinity and Diversity, a Christian affirmation of religious pluralism. And she has 2 books introducing prayer and one introducing preaching that are amazing. I'm just saying, I love Marjorie Suchocki. In so many ways, I had so much fun in this interview. We were hanging out at the Center for Process Studies' 50th anniversary, and we got to go in a room and have a conversation. Even some of my fellow Process Party friends were in the room and joined in during it. But I'm so pumped she's on here. You definitely want to check out her work if you haven't before. If you're looking for something that is theologically rich but devotionally centered, check out 21 Psalms for the 21st Century. But look, before we hop in, I just want to let you all know that this summer is Adult Vacation Bible School. That's right, adult VPS, because why should the kids get all the fun? Just because we can drive, vote, pay taxes doesn't mean we can't have a bunch of fun learning about the Bible. After all, it's full of adult content. So go to adultvbs.com and come join the fun. We're partnering with the Bible for Normal People. You're going to get to hang out with Leah Robinson, practical theologian, author of the Bad Theology live book podcast release event May 11th in Charlotte. Jennifer Garcia Bashaw, Pete Enns, John Dominic Crossan, Anna Siggs. Look, we are going to have so much fun. We're going to have so much fun. You should be there, adultvbs.com. If you want to nerd out with us on the internet right now, in a couple weeks, we start Bonhoeffer and the Future of Faith, an open online class, donation-based, including $0. Go to www.riseofbonhoeffer.com and you can join up with that. But look, that's all I gotta say. I'm so pumped. Marjorie Suchocki's on the podcast. If this isn't one of your favorite episodes of all time, I failed. Okay, because I love her so much, and I've spent lots of time reading all of her books, even some of the real technical process philosophy articles. But what you'll get in this interview is what it sounds like to be a deeply pious, systematic theologian inspired by the philosophical vision of process thought, who wants something beautiful and different for the faith of those who share the name of Jesus going forward. Anyway, here we go. Marjorie, I love her so much. Suchocki. Well, hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. After 14 years, Marjorie Suchocki returns to the podcast, because you were like episode 11.
Really?
Yes, we talked about film and how to view film theologically.
Oh, I need to remember that for tonight.
But for many of you, you've heard me on the podcast talk about my deep love of Marjorie, and now we're in person, so we get to talk in a room again. I want to tell everyone this, but I'm going to tell you, but I already hinted at it. Is when I finished undergrad, the last class in undergrad for my philosophy was philosophy of religion. I went in as a Baptist preacher's kid who actually read the Bible regularly and had the Thomist explain Thomism to me. And I raised my hand and said, "So is this supposed to be Christian philosophy?" And he said, "Yes, it's Thomas Aquinas, the theologian." And I said, "Well, what about, and I just start inserting Bible passages where God changes God's mind, goes just all this dynamic, and I'm like, well, why are all these images that get used? Like Psalm 91, God is like a mother hen, and I start going through it, and he's like, no, well, those are poetic images in Scripture, but if you think that's right philosophically, it's called process philosophy, and it's not compatible with Christianity.
Oh, what a marvelous answer.
And so I went to the library, and
looked up process.
Yeah, read Charles Hartshorne because it was the shortest book, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes.
Right, the very one.
And then I Googled it, and I ended up 3 months later with you in Claremont for the Summer Process Institute. And I was like, oh, no, this is more Christian. And ever since then, I've decided I'm a process evangelist.
Oh.
Like, you brought me to the Lord. That's what I'm talking about.
Well, thank you, Jesus.
And then when I was in div school, we got you and John to come out to Wake Forest University's div school.
Yeah, we did.
And you explained how the Gospel of John was a process
that's
gospel.
right. Yeah.
So,
and I think we also did a movie, or talked about a movie. One of my favorite ones, The Color of Paradise.
Yes.
From Iran. Mm-hmm. Beautiful, beautiful film. And it's process theology.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so I'm just excited. So before we got in anywhere, I just want everyone to know that I'm a deep, deep love, but also just really important for my own vocation as a Christian theologian. Your intro to process thing was so compelling. I'm like, I don't know if it's true, but it's so beautiful. It should be true. And people need to know about this because way too many Christians think God's not even as nice as Jesus.
Okay.
So, could you share a bit of your own origin story? When did Marjorie experience the lure to theologian of the church vocation of super nerdom?
Okay, my road to super nerdom was through philosophy. Mm-hmm. Okay, when I went, and I never took a course in religion. I was afraid to take a course in religion because it might destroy my religion, which is a kind of a brittle evangelicalism, right? And I know there's non-brittle evangelicalism, but mine was sort of brittle. And anyhow, so I only studied philosophy. And I would crawl inside this guy's head, because it was always a guy. And I would try looking out his eyes, through his writings, of course. And I'd either have to hunt for the eyes because they were so big I couldn't reach them, or I'd be so crowded out I could barely see them at all. And that's the way it was as I went through from pre-Socratics on through finally the 20th century. And 20th century was the biggest rattle around head of all. Okay, so that was my trip through philosophy. I loved it dearly, but it was always somebody's philosophy, right? Mm-hmm. Then I discovered Whitehead. He was looking through my head and through my eyes and giving me a name for what I already saw and already knew. And it was like, I was home. Mm-hmm. I was home. So I've been a process theologian ever since. Mm-hmm. Okay. And now I'm not afraid of religion anymore because, of course, it's through a process lens, it makes sense. It's an interrelational world. It's an interrelational God and world. And the whole thing together has the possibility for enormous beauty and also the possibility for enormous pain. Mm-hmm. And both are true. Mm-hmm. And neither one contradicts God, but it's in and through this relational God that you can bear the whole thing.
Yeah.
So it was through philosophy and me looking through other people's heads and suddenly realizing Whitehead and I were looking through the same eyes.
Mm-hmm. The way you even drew that dichotomy of doing philosophy and not religion because of this brittle experience of evangelicalism, I think the number of people who are wrestling with that now is bigger than even then. Like especially after 2016, all the way through Jan 6th, and then the resistance to ecological suicide that's taking place. Like there's this growing number of people who grew up in an evangelical context, experience the dynamic love of God in Christ, and then feel like in order to protect that experience, they have to close their mind off.
I remember it. Yes, I know. I remember hearing a pastor preach. It was in Maine. We were on our way to a vacation, and he was preaching away the feeding of the 5,000. Well, everybody brought their own and everything. I went ballistic. It was just really crazy making for me. Why do you have to go through these dynamics? Mm-hmm. And so with process, the world makes sense again. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So could you share about how did Whitehead give you permission to respond to the questions that you had harbored, in a sense, from your inquiry. Like the brittleness break away, and then there's like new life in the muscles of religion, and seeing like what were those points of brittleness that his philosophy enabled you to, move in a full-throated way, the connections of faith and religion and philosophy.
To use a Shakespearean phrase, he gave a local habitation and a name for what I already knew. Mm-hmm. But now I knew a way to phrase what I felt, a way to say what I felt. And it was liberating. It was really liberating. And it kind of was just sort of like who I was or something. I was wrestling with things like everybody is. I had a very dear husband, but he was very alcoholic as well. It was so hard dealing with it. Okay, here's one illustration of how it helped. Okay, I was married, had been married for many years, and the drinking was really, really hard to handle. And I thought, well, the best thing to do would be if I killed myself, because that would be natural. Nobody, if it was an act like I had a car accident, and then people have car accidents and die. So it would upset everybody, but it wouldn't be as bad as if they thought I killed myself, because then they'd think I didn't love them enough to stay alive, right? So I'm sitting there in the dining room, looking out the window, and it was snowy, and it was in Ohio. And while I'm looking out the window, you'll know I'm really crazy. I was also up in a corner in the ceiling, looking at this strange woman looking out the window with these strange thoughts. And then me up in the corner said, "But you're a process theologian. God is with you, no matter what. Mm-hmm. And you may have some kind of crucifixion going on, but there's a form of resurrection, and all you have to do is take the next step." Mm-hmm. And the next step isn't to go out and drive your car into a bulwark. The next step is you'll see it as you go.
Yeah.
And I felt as if now it's like my intellectual self and my emotional self. And it was all because I actually had become a Whiteheadian. Mm-hmm. And it was true. No matter what the hardship you go through, no matter what, even if you are under the rubbish in a town in Turkey, and you're somehow or other still alive because somehow it left an air pocket for you, and you're afraid nobody's ever going to come and find you, and maybe they don't come and find you, but God is with you anyhow, and there is a next step, and you may take it, even if it's telling the rhymes you told yourself when you were a kid. You can count on God no matter what. But the counting on God no matter what isn't just sitting and looking out your window and thinking how bad things are.
Yeah.
You're counting on God no matter what. It's getting up and knowing what the next thing to do is, even if it's recounting your lullabies from childhood, whatever all it must be like.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how horrible it would be to be stuck like that and then hear a voice from a distance, but it never gets to you. Mm-hmm. Well, and then why did I bring that? Well, because it's stuff you worry about. These are the contemporary issues of our society. This is the sorrow and the pain that's encountered in the reality of being a human, especially if you live on top of a fault line where two continents are scraping past each other, as we do here in Southern California. Yeah. It's one of the results. Anyhow, no, I think a process understanding of God is so deeply with us and so deeply relational and so deeply connectional that when you're alone, you are never actually alone. Mm-hmm. There's always a kind of a witness as you feel the universe around you, in which case being alone is very fruitful sometimes. Mm-hmm. It's not loneliness. It's just alone for time. And I live alone, sort of.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as someone who spent years introducing the more sophisticated and reflective conversations around God with students and future ministers, but also you facilitated confirmation at your local church.
Oh,
and
yes.
You, through Process and Faith, spent time with ministers and helping them engage the Christian tradition in ways like when you think of the word God, what are the unique elements that that Process brings to it to be able to use the word God with the kind of tenderness you just did? A lot of people use the word God or don't, precisely because that tenderness isn't a possibility.
but it is a reality. That is, God is love. And I know that sounds kind of tinny to say, but God is, somebody said it earlier, love and peace. There is an emanation which is love and peace, which is endemic to the nature of God. And since God is always with you, regardless of what you think theologically or philosophically, or whether you don't think about it, there's no one who does not have the presence of God somehow or other with them, helping them to deal with what they've got. And sometimes what they've got is very little, like no home, no bed. Where's God then? Next step God. God is a next step God in times of crisis. And that next step comes from a love that cares even in the midst of crisis. Now, is God one who can say, wait a minute, Shazam, all the problems go away, John's not going to drink anymore? No, of course not. That's not how it is. But even in the Shazam-less moment, there is a quiet possibility that awaits you. And it's the faithfulness and the love of God that does that for you, because everyone is in relation to God all the time, whether they know it or not. And that relationship with God is not a bad you. It's not that at all. It's, this is what you might be able to do about it. I'm convinced that that is the case. And I know sometimes it won't seem like it's the case, but neither did it seem like the case of that woman looking out the window. But it's there.
You telling the next step God reminds me of experience last week when I got a former student of mine's 5-year chip in the mail. And then we get on the phone and talk. I said, thank you. Like we keep up on the internet, but not long talk. And then she told me the story. And this was going to be in my paper, the half that got cut out for time. But it was for you. I was telling you and John this story because I said, what happened? And she goes, well, when I finally decided that I loved my life more than I was treating it, I read through my journals the years I enjoyed it. And when I was 18 and I was in confirmation with you, you were talking about what the nature of God's grace and power was. And you drew on the board a giant pizza. And you said, this is the pie of possibility. And God wants to give all of it to you. But in the next moment, you just get the one bite of that one slice. But how you respond, the crust of it, of the kind of possibilities, it opens up a whole nother place to begin in the next moment. And so the grace of God is that you are worth the gift of possibility every moment. And you may sit here whenever you are in life and in crisis and go, oh, life is horrible. Well, what's going on? I wish I could have that giant pie. And God is saying, let's do it together. And she's telling me back, this story. And I'm sitting there going like, that was my youth group version of Marjorie Suchocki. And she's describing it and she goes, yeah. And so I'm like, that's awesome. She goes, yeah, that stuff really works. I run my NA group in Santa Monica. And she's like, we get the higher power thing. And it gets confusing for people and stuff. And I'm like, I just tell them like, look, whatever language you want to use, what the invitation is to recognize that in the next moment, there is value being gifted to you and you get a chance to say yes. And I tell them, I use the phrase motherly father, fatherly mother, because I grew up Christian, but you don't have to. And so she's telling me this, and it's that beautiful sense that Galilean vision that Whitehead talks about that animated us, that gives us a way of understanding of the divine that resonates deeply with the ministry and message of Jesus, that finds new places and new language all over. But we're saying yes to the actual relational reality.
Yes.
And I think so often people are anxious about being able to prove their vocabulary, that then they, as theologians or religious people, that they end up creating blocks to that gift, which is that the next step or the piece of pie now.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was such a beautiful story. I was like, that's crazy. That was me explaining Marjorie to you, 9 or 10 years ago.
Actually, I think it's right, because that next step is just a little one. I mean, it's not suddenly you're leaping across tall buildings at a single bound, but the next step is incremental. And the hope is, and actually the faith is, that there is not only a next step, but one beyond that, and that will appear in good time. And so you just faithful to take the bite.
Yeah.
Take the bite. And then you might want another one.
Yes. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
One of the questions on Tuesday when we were doing the intro to process theology and philosophy that we didn't get around to, and I personally am a giant fan of how you have introduced it in the past, is the relationship of God and the world. And in process, they use the phrase dipolar.
Yes.
Could you kind of give us a vision for people that want to get a grasp of how God and the world and the two poles relate in kind of each moment of becoming? What have you found as a way of articulating it so people start to get a vision of Whitehead's larger picture?
The infinity symbol. Actually, if you know, it's like a figure eight on its side. God and world constantly interacting, and it's not just God to the world. It's God and the world, and then the response to God, which then leads to, I mean, it really is this kind of figure eight over and over. You see my hands going back and forth. But that becomes an image of the connectional notion, because God comes to the world and has an internal force for how the world might, in fact, become compassionate. But then the return effect to God is God feeling the world, and then out of that feeling, giving the next step. But it means that God feels us just as we feel God, only more completely. So we are constantly in interrelationship with God. Whether we know it or not, whether we believe in God or not, that has nothing to do with whether or not God is there. It's that infinity thing becomes an image of the continuous interaction between world and God. And maybe in the infinity symbol, you do have that one point, and it's kind of in between, and I'm not sure how that works, but it doesn't matter.
Well, when I do that version of Marjorie, I use the phrase, and that is when God and the world kiss.
Oh, I like
it. and I do this.
Yes.
And people and my youth would go like, Are you doing an infinity symbol kissing, or are you doing like Pac-Man? But I would, God in the world, and then there's a kiss.
Yes.
And that would be like, and that's why God is erotic.
Yeah, I like it. It's good. Thank you. But then you know what? It's also like this. When we talk like this, we're giving this marvelous image. But then you have to think of the reality of evil in the world. There's real pain, and a pain that is hardly able to be borne, and that sometimes is simply the result of vast, effective, Bambi meets Godzilla, evil. You know that film, Bambi meets Godzilla?
No.
Well, it's a really good image. It was a short film. There's the credits. Bambi meets Godzilla, and then, the producer is so-and-so, and whoever produced so-and-so was the parents of the first person, and whatever. And meanwhile, Bambi is just plowing the earth and smelling the air, and the flowers are there, and Bambi is very happy. And the credits go on and on and on through the Poet and Peasant Overture, I think, probably from William Tell. And anyhow, then all of a sudden, the credits are over, and you see this little line up in the corner, and it gets bigger and bigger, and then it has these little things here, and it's this giant foot, and then splat. And then you see, 4 little legs coming out. Bambi meets Godzilla. You never saw that. You would have liked that film. But sometimes evil is like that. Bambi meets Godzilla, and it just plumps you down. And like you'll never, ever get up. That foot will never come off of you. So the experience of evil, it's kind of comical, but it's also tragic. Because sometimes it's the horrible pain of an illness. Worst, it's the horrible pain of something horrible happening to people you love.
Yeah.
Or intentional evil, the abuse of children, the abuse of animals, of degradation of the environment. Just evil that doesn't belong in a creation that's good, and yet it's there. And what happens to the infinity circle then? The same thing. the same thing is going all the time, regardless of what the evil is, which means that even in your darkest hour, well, Winston, right? Even in the darkest hour, you can hang on anyhow. And the way out might be a way of justice in the world. It might not be a way of justice in the world. It might be like the damnation of evil. But by God, in God, there is finally justice. And you will finally experience it because you're not going to be in this world forever.
Yeah.
So anyhow.
So underneath like that, the way you're describing evil and the potential of redemption in the divine are subtle critiques of what have been dominant understandings of evil in the Christian faith and an expansive account of sin. I'd love for you to kind of name how you came to those kind of the classical doctrine of like sin and evil, and how the process vision helped you rethink it and expand it to actually acknowledge, right, the reality of evil, but also to think about sin in a more robust way without factualizing a myth or denying our interconnectedness.
Well, see, I think sin is ultimately the violation of love. And that is at the same time the violation of the good. And sometimes it's essential, violation of well-being is just, you grow, right? But see, God feels it too. So that, what does God do with it? That's what pushed me to eschatology. You can't just say, God feels it too, and it's just as bad for God, except God is bigger and God can handle it better. That's stupid. It's got to be that God can take that, and in God there is a redemptiveness which then can infiltrate to us in whatever form we can handle. We can't always handle very much. But that God has got to be such that we know that when we receive the touch of God and give back, God receives the touch of us. And out of that touch integrates who we are into who God is and gives us back then part of the results, which include a mode of redemption in this moment, in this time, no matter how. So to me, it's really important to be able to imagine God as a place where there is finally justice. But then I will also say, justice always includes compassion. I think compassion, we call it love, maybe we should call it compassion, is central to the role of God and to the rule of God. Compassion is the ultimate virtue that I think should be displayed in the world, which is, of course, a form of love. But we should call it compassion, because love has so many different meanings for us. Romantic love, mother love, father love. Compassion is caring for the other, particularly when the other has no other resource. The widow, the orphan, the stranger within your gates.
Right there, you make me want to ask about the book that's about to come out that I haven't got to read yet. So, but you mentioned it briefly, but spending time over the last few years through COVID and lockdown, going through the Psalms over and over again. I'd love for you to tell us that experience. Like, what was it like being Marjorie Suchocki, most epic of process theologians, going through the Psalms over and over again?
Okay, here we are. Here's this pandemic. It's this miserable thing. I mean, it was a miserable thing. It is a miserable thing. And I decided the way to cope with it was just to read a psalm a night, starting with Psalm 1 and going through Psalm 150, and then assuming that there were more than 150 days of the pandemic, going right back to Psalm 1 again. But what happened was the second reading, and then the third reading, the fourth reading. In other words, just keep reading a psalm, and I still read a psalm a night. Although sometimes Walter Brueggemann tells me I have to read something else too. He makes me read Jeremiah.
It's good to know that that's who gives you homework.
Okay, so let me tell you about the psalm. The second time through, you begin seeing different things. So you think, okay, this is the Psalm of David. Well, what's going on with David? So then you have to read 1st and 2nd Samuel. Oh, no wonder this psalm looks like it does. It's like the psalm begins to take on a contour, a context of something. And then, you have to now read 1st and 2nd Kings. Pretty soon you have to read everything. And then you find this deep consonance between, theology, for want of a better word, the theology of the Psalms and the theology that runs all through the Hebrew Scriptures. And it's compassion. and it begins hitting you. You read the Psalms, and again, you find the importance of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger within your gates, and the need for compassion with these people. And then when you're reading the histories, you see that any time a nation is falling, it's because they haven't paid any attention to the poor. Mm-hmm. And then there's another part of it. You will not gain your wealth on the backs of the poor. Mm-hmm. And I think payday lenders, even then, that to gain your privileges by depleting the well-being of the poor is evil. And again, nations are judged by how well, or if in fact they do exploit the poor, mm-hmm. because the poor you always have with you. Why? And there tends to be greed, and greed is a zero-sum game. All me, zero you. More or less. And then the other thing in the scripture, in these Psalms that came through is against idol worship.
Right.
Now, I am a religious pluralist. I think God has many religions going on. And I think that the God I call God may be called Buddha or it doesn't mm-hmm. matter, but that God is revelational, and that revelation is in and through a culture in the way that culture can bear. And there's not one which is better than another. Mm-hmm. They are each appropriate to the culture. For instance, where is it written that the Aborigines of Australia were ignored by God because we hadn't invented ships and airplanes and television?
Yeah.
Really, is the God that you serve in Jesus Christ so totally isolated that the poor Aborigines are just left to, the devil in hell? This is stupid. Mm-hmm. This is really stupid. So clearly, God, who is revelational for us, is revelational for them too. Mm-hmm. And so could you convert them from their religion to yours? Why?
One of the things in what's the red book on pluralism that you wrote?
Divinity and Diversity.
Yes. The first time I read that, I came into it coming to process as a Baptist preacher's kid and that kind of thing. And, being able to affirm the incarnation in Christ without crossing your fingers or saying stupid stuff was really exciting for me, because I inherited this tradition, and it was blessing, and I saw it animate beautiful things in my life and in this community and blah, blah, blah. And I remember reading that book because of the process framework, right? Like, Jesus doesn't come in a vacuum. One of my favorite lines in the Didache is that Jesus is the fruit of the vine of David. Like, if there wasn't already this tradition, then what, if we're speaking, in process, the way Jesus prehends the past is prehending those kisses of God in the world, in the history and life of Israel.
Yes.
And then he is giving fruit through his faithfulness in a unique way that opens up for us, right, the structure of Christian existence, the resonance of the divine mind in Christ, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And like, if you get this beautiful vision, you're like, oh, hell yeah, this is awesome. And I remember reading your book and going, oh, junk. If that's actually how God is, then all these other wisdom traditions, I finally get to overhear what the one that loves me most has been whispering to people I've just now getting to meet.
Yeah.
And you're like, my religion is revelation traditioning, and those are too. What do I get to do? And I was like, oh, see, another reason I love Marjorie Suchocki.
Well, my daughter-in-law is a Buddhist, and I so affirm her Buddhism. Mm-hmm. I could envy her the dearness of how she is a Buddhist. And my grandchildren, from my son John and Tracy, they are also Buddhists, and it pleases my heart. Mm-hmm. Because they are such dear, compassionate, loving people. And that is God and Christ in them. Or I say God and Christ, it's God and Buddha in them. Mm-hmm. But I think God is such that there must be a diversity of religions, or else God is very parochial.
Yeah.
And how can that be? It's God of the universe, right? Mm-hmm. So clearly there must be initial aims all over the place. Does God stop giving an initial aim? Well, only to one culture? This is stupid.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I think there should be interreligious dialogue and interreligious sharing, not for the sake of converting, but for the sake of enriching. Mm-hmm. Oh, God said that to you, huh? Well, no, maybe I shouldn't say God said that to you, but to me, I think it's God saying that to you, because there are non-theistic religions, and I don't think God cares about name badges. Mm-hmm. I mean, okay, you who remember my name, Jehovah. I mean, Yeah. So you shouldn't expect to look for the similarities. In fact, it's more interesting to look for the differences.
Mm-hmm. It's like when we first moved to Los Angeles, rural North Carolina, your neighborhood is not quite as diverse as Los Angeles.
Yes.
And when we moved back, and you're packing up your house, I realized our spice cabinet had about 4 times as many spices in it because I liked my neighbor's food. And I'm like, I like it, all the different Indian food spices. And then in California, the number of peppers that are dried, crushed to make all sorts of different beautiful food are there. And now I'm like, I have 14 different chilies.
Yes.
And in the South, you just have a thing called chili powder, right? And it comes in giant boxes at Costco. It's so many times I feel like that shift of like once you recognize within your own tradition, God's arrival and giftedness in each moment, and then you go, well, that's the same God in the others. Then you're like, ooh, I wonder if we hang out long enough, how big our spice cabinets can be.
Yeah.
Because, we like zest.
Great image. That's a good image.
Well, now I'm feeling real good about myself. This affirmation, Mark. That's whoo. Going back to your experience with the Psalms, how do you read differently these poetic, anticipating music, ways of capturing the multiplicity of human experiences within the cultic life of Israel? How did you come to read those differently than, say, as a process theologian, when Brueggemann's like, Marjorie, you should probably check out Samuel. And then you start going through the history. How does the process framework change the way you engage those different genres of scripture reading?
Well, I think a process framework tries to give you an openness to what you're going to be reading and seeing rather than an expectation of what it's going to be. But then you will find, or I did find, these commonalities. And I broke off at one point. I know, it bothered me because of all the diatribes against the people around them and everything. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, what's going on with all this sort of stuff? And then I found out that, well, actually what the diatribe was about was, even within Judaism, when you worshiped these idols, you usually have to offer up your child in sacrifice to show how much you love the idol more than anything else, which I think is a horrible, horrible thing. And God was absolutely against it. So that in your worship of God or your worship of any deity, you be careful that those whom you love around you don't become sacrificed for what you think that God must want of you. Mm-hmm. But what God would want from you is the well-being of as many as possible within your purview. Yeah. Not to sacrifice them to show your piety, but in fact, to love them because of your piety.
Yeah. Well, luckily Christendom hasn't come up with ways of deep, of alternative forms of idolatry that sacrifice people to death-dealing systems, including our non-human neighbors. That's it's always a perk. That's how we've evolved.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I tell you, it's well, I am a Christian. That's just plain it. I am a Christian. I guess I was born to be a Christian. My grandfather was a Plymouth Brethren preacher back in the last century, and that is extremely dispensational, old-fashioned evangelical. That's my lineage. I think I got his spirit or something or other, because I'm the only one in my family who's practically religious. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, I think I digress.
So, even there, one of the things that thinking about that much more apocalyptic style eschatology, right? And in the Plymouth Brethren, one of the things that you, in the end of evil, but then also in the way in God Christ Church, when you're thinking about eschatology in a process perspective, is thinking through what is a realized eschatology and how the process perspective actually opens up those texts that liberal Protestants run from. So, when you think of the task of thinking about the doctrine of eschatology and the kind of rather perverse popular opinions that that dominate in American culture, how does your process perspective reintroduce those questions again?
I think eschatology is both present and for us, but only for us, future, because I think the future is everlasting in God. So that God is everlastingly an eschaton, if you would say. But to me, and this comes basically from biblical stuff, and especially this stuff in the Hebrew scriptures, as well as in the Christian scriptures, that there is finally justice. And justice is that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And that God is the transformation of the universe, or for us, the world, into an everlasting, love. And that's the nature of God. And from that, and I think of it as an intensely dynamic love. I contrasted it sometime with an image that I used to get from reading and teaching Augustine's City of God, when I think in one of the last chapters, he has all the little people in heaven creeping over to the edge of heaven and looking down and seeing all the folks writhing in hell because they're fighting with each other eternally. And then they rush back into heaven happy with their boredom. Because I think it's not like that.
Really? No.
It's not like that. No, I don't think it's like that. But that instead, that God's everlastingness is an everlasting both joy and peace, both calm and ebullience, that word, that there's this togetherness of all things, and that the nature of God is the redress of every evil, which means the transformation of every evil. How does this happen? I think it happens because of God's sealing of the world. And this is all imaginary. That I assume that, and that there has to be immortality. If there isn't, there is no justice. And I can't imagine a world, this God, that has no justice at all. And there is a justice in God which has an effect on the world. Okay, that in God, we shall immediately enter into a process of being known as we are known. Because if God receives the whole world, and I have damaged someone terribly, that person is also in God. But if I am taken within the prehension of God, each prehension feels the other prehensions, and in God I know what I have done to her or to him or to it or whatever. And knowing how they experience what I have done is in fact my hell. It is a judgment that burns the dross away. But it's also the case that they too in God have been redeemed and have gone past that pain into the depths of the love of God. And I feel their redemption in God, and their redemption becomes my redemption as well. So that the process of judgment is the process of salvation. Not judgment and then salvation. Judgment is salvation, because in and through that judgment you are cleansed and you participate fully and full-heartedly, if that's an appropriate phrase, in the joy of God and in the peace and the love of God, and that there is a welcoming committee, if you will, waiting for you, which is the beginning of you shall know as you are known, and all manner of things shall be well. All manner of things shall be well, that God is the redemption of the world. And we are called then to be redemption in the world in ways that are possible for us, whether it's being compassionate to those who are troubled, giving, helping with food crisis, being more ecologically, this wonderful conference, listening to these people give papers talking about how to be human in the world, in a process world where you work to the common good. It's inspiring. And we're called to do that here in preparation for its everlasting fullness.
Yeah. That the line that God is the redemption of the world every moment, right? Like in God, and then because God is the redemption of the world, we're invited to join that redemption.
That's right. And we become the agents of redemption as we experience our own redemption here and now. And go back to the lady in the corner, right? My redemption is to look for the next step. And helping other people maybe to find the next step. And people all over do that. You heard that wonderful woman talking this morning about a new way of creating energy and for the community. These are next steps. These are the little baby steps. And if we take them all, especially with the world, the ecological crisis is why are we destroying this wonderful planet? Anyhow, the call of God is kindly stop destroying it. And here are some ways you might take steps toward it. Maybe to finally, or maybe we won't. And this planet will kaboom, and that's the end of this story.
Yeah.
But God has other stories.
That, just describing eschatology and the way it's framed in process, it was a life-changing thing for me when I first encountered it. And it made sense of the prayer we were told to pray all the time. This is one of my favorite Marjorie Suchocki lines. The occasion is twice born, first through its own self-creation and second through God's total prehension of this self-creation. And that's like that infinity sign. And then a little bit later you say, God reaches toward the world, both as it is and as it can be. To the world, God as such an actual entity is truly God for us. And yet the world is equally for God. In the rhythmic responsiveness which is integral to the concept of God as an actual entity, the world moves towards its redemptive completion in God, adding thereby to the completion of God. And the reality of heaven passes back into the world in everlasting process.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I'm glad you agree with yourself.
Yeah, I do.
Because it is so pretty.
Yeah. So we become, and this is really, I think, crazy, but we become part of God's redemption of the world insofar as we respond to the call of compassion. And a compassion that reaches to the natural world, as well as to the creatures in the world, as well as to the forests of the world, to the bugs of the world, to the people of the world. I think compassion is what we are called to live. And I think I see the same thing, can you believe it, in Buddhism, in Taoism, and I'm sure in the Aborigines of Australia, that I think God calls the world in ever so many ways, none of which is deeply privileged than another, because if it's God doing the call, by God, that's the call of God, honor it, right? But it is almost universally a call to compassion.
So your process eschatology, in some sense, is thinking metaphysically about the Lord's Prayer.
Oh, yes.
Yes, go ahead.
No, yeah. But I learned a lot from Thomas Aquinas here in his exposition of the Lord's Prayer. I can't ever find it. I try looking for it again, but he wrote so much, it's very hard to find anything. It's just a huge book. Okay. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Or however you have to say the words, because we all know them too well. So it's already a connection between earth and heaven. And the connection between earth and heaven is the nature of God, which is a call to love, which is basically a call to compassion, which is a call to work, a call to do something about it. It's an active call. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And then I love it that the fact, give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's the only conditional gift. Isn't that nice? There's one condition. Forgive us the way we forgive others. That limits God's forgiveness of us by how we deal with those who we feel have offended us. I think that's the most powerful part of the whole prayer. Okay? So anyhow, what you have in the prayer is like the conditions of life. And the conditions of life are compassion and sustenance shared with all, and then a deliverance from evil. Well, that's looking for your next step. Thank you very much. And I think that's pretty much where Jesus drops it. We added, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Anyhow, yeah, I think the Lord's Prayer is pretty processy.
Oh, yeah. And I think you wrote my favorite book on prayer.
Oh, thank you.
It is also one of the easiest ways of introducing process thought to a Christian who, because I think a lot of Christians' experience of the divine is process, and their theology gets in the way.
Yes. Yes.
And so when you are in hanging out with other liberal Protestants, and if you ask almost all the other ones, the ones that cross their fingers if you talk about the reality of God that does anything, And you ask, oh, why pray? They're like, well, prayer changes us. It doesn't change God. Or prayer is, and there's regularly among liberal Protestants a deep hesitation to talk robustly about prayer as a means of connecting, engaging, and responding to God.
Oh, yes.
And then I'm like, have you not read Marjorie's book? Because I really feel like you'd want to pray more. And so when you hear when people are asking you why pray, what's prayer? How do you begin that conversation?
How do I begin it? Would that it would begin. People seldom say, "How do you pray?" But I mean, by opening yourself to God. And opening yourself, I think, in a sense, to the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, mostly the Hebrew scriptures. I think they're much richer. By knowing that you are in connection with God and you're doing it intentionally, not just automatically. And in the intentionality, you, in a sense, give yourself to God and you consider how have you dealt with those who trespass against you, if you have those who do.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes when I like theologians that much, and wherever there are disagreements, I just project my opinion on them because I just feel like I'm known by when I read them. Yeah, you do. And when John read the chapter in My Christology about him, and he's like, "Oh, I don't remember saying all of that," and I was like, "But I wish I had, or maybe I did," and I was like, I can't remember what the line was, and I was like, John, do you remember the book you did on Jesus with the 5 different views and y'all all responded to each other? You got this pushback from Stephen Davies, and your response was, because he was, all worked up about you not believing in the incarnation and all that kind of stuff. And your response was, no, Jesus internalized the primordial nature of God into his self-conception such that his fidelity of God, that he literally is the image of the invisible God made present through his faithfulness as a full human, and he goes, oh, those kind of pushbacks did get me a bit irritated. So I used it to have he was like, oh yeah, I did. I guess I did get there.
Yeah. So prayer is opening yourself to the God who is always with you. And then God takes your prayer and does with it what God can. I think we should do intercessory prayer. Mm-hmm. We should pray for those who are in distress, because I feel God uses everything that is available, and what's available is what is in heaven and what is in earth. And that since we are in earth, we also need that stuff which is earthly in our ongoingness. So when you pray for others, if you pray for their food, you then better pay attention to the food pantries. Mm-hmm. And prayer is opening yourself to the will of God, and that will encompasses the well-being of yourself and others beyond you. So prayer is an openness to join in the work of God for, let me say it this way, the salvation of the world. Mm-hmm. But the salvation of the world is not that they say all the right religious words. The salvation of the world is compassion. To be compassionate to one another, to be compassionate to the disappearing monarch butterflies, to be compassionate to the creatures of the ocean who are bombarded with the noise of the ocean, how they could remain sane, if fish remain sane, is a miracle. Think of compassion for the world. And then your job is to join with God in acting compassionately in the world. And then God takes what you do, blends it with what God can do, and makes something better possible. Mm-hmm. Now, is this onward and upward forever? No, because often we fail in the whole process. We give up on the world. We give up on compassion. We just say, well, it is what it is. These people like living homelessly under the bridges. They like having nothing to eat. They like the cement. It's so comfortable at night. And a couple of newspapers are all they need to keep warm. This is so stupid. Mm-hmm. But compassion means to care about these things in the world and do what you can about it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you even said at the beginning, right? The potential of participating in divine compassioning, I think also means choosing compassion for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, when your own self-understanding is determined, that when you are your trauma, or you are your pain, or you are the judgment and condemnation other people have given you, then the inbreaking of heaven is recognizing that the one that knows you completely, loves you completely, and wants you to receive that affirmation in the next moment. Mm-hmm. And the recognition of your own frailty, brokenness, and pain as the site for the coming of God.
Yes.
It ultimately empowers us to recognize it in our neighbor.
Yes.
And then maybe our enemy.
Yes.
And that kind of thing. And when our vision of God, especially as Christians, I think this has historically been a problem, is one where we don't know if God ultimately loves all of us, then it's not surprising our discipleship sucks. If you think the mystery of God isn't the mystery of infinite love, but there might be this dark side. Or when you look at your neighbor and you wonder, were they chosen before the foundations of the world? Or you wonder, are they, just how depraved are they? We have come up as a religious tradition with a host of justifications for denying the very giftedness of God-belovedness. And you're like, and this is obviously a bit of projection, but God's like, well, then why the hell did I take up flesh? I do it every moment. Like, Jesus wasn't like the weird escape plan. It was the revelation that I've refused to be God without you that moment, the next moment, and whatever you end up going. It's like you can't escape the love of God in Christ Jesus. You could go all the way to Sheol, and I'm ready to show up. Please respond. And as long as we keep resisting the invitation of divine love, then it does not bear fruit in us, and it does not go through us to our neighbor. And I think in our time where people can see the systemic, institutional, and historic violence through our history, one of the gifts the process vision at large and process Christians, I think, can give is declarative statements that you are ultimately valued in this moment and the next.
Yes.
And the most true thing about you is your belovedness.
Yes, and it has to extend to, and the same is true for you. Mm-hmm. And the same is true for the ones you despise. This stupid polarization that divides our nation now is a valoration of hate in the name of what? Mm-hmm. I don't even know what it's in the name of, but not to honor or regard the other is a violation of everything we thought God had given us.
Mm-hmm. One of my fellow students, when I was here, was an Orthodox priest who then came back to do a PhD and it took the Summer Institute. And we were, at the lunch before we go watch the movie, and then Marjorie blows our mind doing process interpretations of it. And I was like, so why are you doing the Summer Process Institute? And he goes, well, yes, y'all are heretics, and I don't know if you're all Christian, but it's the only time I've been in a room with so many theologians that at least try to act like Jesus. Oh. And so that he starts telling the interactions he'd had with you and John, and he's like, their theology's suspect, but the way they attend to you is so important. And in class, he had shared, I don't remember what the question was about evil, but he had talked about, like in the parish, his struggle to be present with someone when he wants to know why God wasn't there, right? Oh. And you responded, and you didn't correct his theology or try to explain process. You responded to his experience that he was there. And you said, it was one of those moments you get derailed in class. And I was like, man, Marjorie's like a minister right now. And you kind of, you do your walk around. And then if you decide to have a conversation with someone, you'll shift where you're not standing over them. And you lean over and you're like, and how did that feel? And he starts talking about, and I didn't know what the word to say and all that kind of stuff. And you go, and yet you were there. And yet you were there. And so often we don't need solutions. We just want to know if you're there, then maybe God might be.
Oh, yeah.
And you did and I was like, oh, shit, I want to go to her revival right now. But I give that as an example because I feel like part of what is compelling is that this theology actually helps articulate humanity being human with each other.
Yes.
And if you read the Gospels, I think that's Jesus is running around going, y'all have come up with all sorts of stories you tell yourself to suck at living. Yeah. Like you use sin what? To justify your exploitation or your disowning of these people. You go around and anyway, that I think to me that has been one of the it is a non-intellectual yet more compelling expression
Yes.
of process thought.
Yeah. I think you're doing a great work.
Well, all right, y'all are going to get to ask a question right now at the end, because I have one more I want to ask you. And since they've been sitting here
Do you
so
think
quiet.
I could answer it?
Yeah, this one's
Okay.
Well, I think you can, because the only preaching book I ever finished was yours.
Are you kidding?
And I'll tell you why I love it, but that I just loved for you to share briefly, like how you understood the task of preaching, because a lot of time when we think about preaching, you either have the aesthetics of it, right, and like how it's supposed to be, or the proclamation of the word, and then you're wrestling with how you do personal stories to scripture, or how does the exegesis change things, and all that kind of stuff. And the book begins where you basically go, well, you walk in a room and God's there, and some of the people will be present enough to meet that. And you get the gift of naming how it's been present in the history of the traditions and the text. But you're also the one that gets to know the lives, so you can name it in their lives. And it's like the event of the word, and it becomes this beautiful picture.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of ministers that listen to this that have read really bad preaching books. So my main thing was like, if you're a preacher who's been thinking, process is interesting, blah, 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 how do you want to encourage your students then and those now to think about the gift or opportunity of preaching?
Because God is offering opportunities to every single person in your congregation. Mm-hmm. And your job is to help their awareness of the fact that God is giving them something. Now, maybe it will be through the text. That's the only thing you have through which to work. In which case, you have the obligation to study that text and let it come alive for you, and then speak from it and trust that God is working with people as you speak. Because why wouldn't God be working with people as you speak? Not because it's you speaking. It's because it's God who works with everything to bring about what the individual in the congregation and what the congregation as a whole needs in order to move toward whatever next steps are. And the other thing about pastoral stuff is you're not just speaking to individuals, you're speaking to a congregation, thank you very much. And that congregation has a work to do as a congregation, which maybe they can begin to discern in and through the way you lift up the text, which is God speaking to people in the past and in the present and everything else, to make people aware that God is present for your good. Mm-hmm. And it's not for your condemnation, unless that helps you at the moment to feel some condemnation because, I was pretty mean, that person, or whatever. But God is present to each person in your congregation. And your job as a preacher is to lift up their awareness of what God is saying to them now, in and through being together and through the text. And it's like a whole complex of a unity of becoming. So to get them out of one-on-one, but one-on-one plus one plus one plus one, to the sense of the congregation as a whole, the sense of the individual as a whole, and the sense of being together in worship of God. Mm-hmm. That's the sermon builds, I think, on that kind of a dynamic.
Yeah. I remember there's a moment in the book where you're laying all that out, and you made an observation. It's either there or when I've heard you talk about it that I had never thought of. And you said, for most of church history, they didn't go home and read this by themselves in a room. It's always been a text that was read out loud to largely people that didn't know how to read.
Yes,
and the
illiterate.
Mystery of the text was what we all did together.
Yes.
And so one of the problems, the problems of Protestant preaching is they think they're giving you ammo for quiet time, and you're not preaching. You're not preaching to individuals because God's redeeming the whole world.
Yes.
And so I just find that a lot of preaching text are people that are professionals at quiet time. So then they get encouraged, and you go to seminary and you get good at exegesis. And then you think, I'm somehow, by the time I get done, going to convince them to spend about 15 minutes to reread this text with all the brilliance I gave them to know I'm right. And you're like, what a waste of time. And this isn't even how the church has worked for so long. Yes, it's a gift to go read it and prepare, and you can wrestle with it as a Christian, but that's not a sermon. And I just remember thinking, That's exactly what I thought sermons were for a long time.
Well, actually, you know what comes to my mind as you're talking is the experience of being in Notre Dame. I don't know if you can go into it yet. Again, I think the windows were saved. Mm-hmm. But the windows, as they are in all those medieval churches, are the text because the people were illiterate. Mm-hmm. They didn't know how to read. They weren't going to go off and have their quiet time with their Bible. No, they weren't. But they had the text illustrated for them all around them. And the ones I really liked were in the island, Sicily, right? Mm-hmm. Where now what you're seeing are images of the stories of the water. So that they read the Bible stories through the images of God rescuing you from the waters or in the midst of the waters, or giving you an abundance through the waters. The pictures on the wall were the Bible for you. Well, now we think they should go off and read the Bible all by themselves. Well, they should should have a little help reading the Bible. I mean, I really think so. But anyhow, yes, now we do the preaching, and we become the pictures on the wall in words. Mm-hmm. And so maybe we ought to preach in pictures. Mm-hmm. Have in our mind an image of God speaking to all these people at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And using their context, and I'm part of the context, then it's my job to be as good a context as I can. And mm-hmm. then you and God take care of the rest.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. All right, Dan. John.
Is there anything we haven't said?
Yes. No. We had such a good conversation yesterday.
Yeah, we did. It was fun.
And it was surprising to me because it's very few people nowadays that I can get really passionate about Tanakh.
I know it. Isn't it wonderful?
Right.
Yeah. To me, it's like, oh, I wish I'd been a biblical scholar and I would study Hebrew scriptures. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or be like, no, I think it's best, AJ, there's this incredible New Testament professor at Vanderbilt. I used to do visiting stints in Vanderbilt, and I got to know Amy J. AJ, we called her. She's teaching New Testament. Wonderful, a Jewish person teaching New Testament, and a Christian person teaching Tanakh, but seeing it for what it is instead of what we think it ought to be. I love Tanakh. I thought it was to me it was liberating, and we've been talking about it the whole time. It's emphasis on compassion. Mm-hmm. The widow, the orphan, the stranger within your gates, and judging the nations by how compassionate they were. Isn't that something? And even idolatry, not because I don't want any other religions except the one I've given to you. No. But because you have turned your religion into something that means you must sacrifice that which is the nearest and dearest to you, and that will make me happy. I don't think so. Mm-hmm. So they would, like with Abraham and Isaac, they would burn children on altars. And I would read this stuff about idol worship in the Tanakh, and then every now and then it would say why. And the why was you offer your children to your God. Not in baptism or something, but by killing them, by causing pain, by giving trauma. That's why it wasn't he was against the religion, he was against the pain and trauma you were giving to your kids. Mm-hmm. And if you have such a religion that requires you to give pain and trauma to those you care for, that's something wrong with that religion.
Yeah.
Yeah, so anyhow, and I'm a pluralist, but not if, in fact, your religion requires that you do harm to others. Mm-hmm. So anyhow, the Tanakh is so clearly a conversation about justice all the way through. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. Anyhow, and sometimes it's crazy. I mean, the diatribes against the nation drive me batty. Well, they do.
Yeah.
But then you come across Lamentations, reading the 5 chapters of Lamentations. What you really want is the middle one. The middle one, great is thy faithfulness. And then, we sing that hymn in church. Hey, guess what? That's Hebrew. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. Thy faithfulness endures forever. You can count on God forever. It's the steadfast love of God, which you can't do a thing about destroying because it's not destructible. You can count on the love of God no matter what, and that's the Tanakh. Mm-hmm. That's the Tanakh. And I learned that partly through Walter Brueggemann, And why I got in touch with him was because I was reading the American Standard Version of the Bible, and it translates Hesed, Hesed, Hebrew word, as loving kindness. Oh, I thought, isn't that lovely? The loving kindness of God. I really can dig that. That's wonderful. And then I looked at another version, and it's steadfast love. Well, this version is later than that, which is right. And so I got in touch with Walter Brueggemann. I said, which one is right? He came back thundering, steadfast love. It's not loving kindness. Loving kindness says nothing about steadfastness. In your life, loving kindness is nice and sweet and everything, but it's the steadfast, unstoppable love of God, which depends upon the character of God and not upon you, my kids. Mm-hmm. God is steadfast love. That's the Hebrew Bible. That's Tanakh. All the way through the prophets, all the way through the Psalms, all the way through the history. It's incredible. How come we Christians don't notice that? We're stupid.
Yeah, this was pretty much our conversation yesterday, and we were both talking about how stupid Christians are. It was wonderful. And I'm one of them.
I'm one of them. Yeah, but anyhow, no, I have grown to really love those Hebrew scriptures. And so I was telling him, I found in my grapevine library, just a regular town library, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Study Bible. So, because I was working with these Psalms, and I wanted to know, well, how do the Hebrews deal with these Psalms? How do Jews deal with these Psalms? And so I got this book out. Oh, I loved it. Finally, I couldn't just keep renewing it. I just went and bought it. And it has commentary. It's an incredible Bible, Tanakh. It's not the Bible. Anyhow, each page has columns beside the columns, saying, this is how this worked. This is where this took place. This is the time we're talking about. This is who possibly wrote it. This is possibly the reason why. And it's an incredibly illuminating thing to read that, especially when you're reading about the diatribes against the nations. Mm-hmm. So anyhow, I've really come to love the Hebrew Bible a lot. And in my next life, I'm going to learn a lot more about it. If there's reincarnation, which there probably isn't. But if there were, that's what I'd do.
Well...
So I had a couple of questions that were more so personal, because I'm always interested. I love hearing about your plans on what you're going to do for your 90th birthday. And it makes me think, what do you think at 90, since you told me that the way you do your birthday is on January is when you turn 90, no matter what day you were born,
Yeah, that's right.
So you're 90.
I'm 90. I was born in 1933. This is 2023. This is my 90th year.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, what do you sense is the next step for Marjorie?
My next step? I have no idea. I just be myself. Actually, no. This is what I've decided. I've offered to the church I would like to teach a class on a brief history of Christian doctrine. Because they have a Trinity window up there, and I would look at it and I think, I wonder if they know what they're looking at. And I don't know if they do. I don't even know if they look at it. And I thought, I wonder if they know how the Trinity happened anyhow. I mean, why we began talking about that. And I said, if here their church with a Trinity window, the people ought to know what it means, or what it has meant, and what it may not mean. Mm-hmm. So why don't I teach a class on the history of Christian doctrine? And so what would you do? You'd begin with, well, what's wrong? And have a session on doctrine of sin. This is how it, and all the stupid stuff about it, and all the important stuff about it. Basically, it's a lack of compassion, but it's whatever. So anyhow, I would just do that, and then I would say, well, what can be done about it? And so then you have theories of salvation, and then, well, who's going to get this done? And then you'd have one on Christology. Well, what about God? Well, here's a Trinity. Ha ha ha! Why we started, and then the so what? Well, there's a church, and then what? And that's eschatology. And so I could do Christian history in 6 sessions, and I would have maybe an hour each time. But I would be selective and basically tell them how we got to where we got. So that's what I want to do next. And I have a wonderful book called The Textbook of Christian Doctrine that I discovered myself, because to enter the PhD program in Claremont, you had to take 4 exams, one of which was in history of doctrine. What did I know about that? Very little. So I found this book, Textbook of the History of Doctrine by Seeberg, written around the 19th century, I guess, the turn to the 20th century. It was a marvelous compendium. It gave you all this stuff. So I'll just go look it all up again and give my own twist on some of it. So that's what I'm going to do.
Sounds wonderful.
And I also began teaching the Bible by going to Perkins School of Theology, reference room, and start looking at the scholars on it. That's why I got in touch with Brueggemann, because I had his commentary on the Psalms. As well, I'm going to write in the Psalms. I think I need to learn something. So I used his commentary, and then I have a problem. Well, I guess I'll get in touch with him. And I've been in touch with him ever since. He's a really great guy. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, so what will I do next? I think I'll just keep studying, probably the Tanakh.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And then another thing, if you could go back to 30-year-old Marjorie, what would you tell her, given what you know now? Either personally or about the world, or...
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't say anything?
Nope. I just, look what you're going to find out, kid.
Just put on your seatbelt, strap in.
Yeah. I guess, in those days, it was long ago, and I was a young wife and mother. When I was 30, we lived in Topsfield. No, I think it would unfold. Yeah, I was married to a guy I loved. He's alcoholic, and I don't think I would have said anything. You just have to go through it and find your way and count on God. There, I always did that. Even though, because I was an evangelical, born of apocalyptic traditions, right?
And me too.
Yeah, and that felt fragile to me, because how I was living did not compute with, happily ever after. Mm-hmm. Well, not if you have an alcoholic husband who you really love. Anyhow, I would not have said anything to her. I would have said, you have a journey ahead of yourself. Do it.
Thank you.
So we were joking about your next life, but I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about immortality. And you touched on it a bit earlier. And
well, this is what I think. Okay, now I'll tell you my dream. Did I ever tell you my dream? I've told so many students my dream.
I haven't heard it.
Well, eschatology has always been important to me. Not because I want to live forever and ever, but because I want there to be justice. I really want there to be a redress of the terrible. I read Dostoevsky. I was writing a dissertation on evil. Why? Because I'm dealing with the stuff. And Dostoevsky, I thought I'd read him just for fun. Brothers Karamazov, right? Oops, a mistake, right? So for me, the importance of eschatology, I had to imagine a way in which there really could be justice that was just. Now, why did you ask this question? Because I answered it.
Certainly, yeah. Let me give you a little bit more context. So I started learning about process maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and your books, and I believe the first thing I read from you was just a PDF document on Jay McDaniel's website, which was a Q&A, which I think maybe came from a little red book at one point. Okay. But God Christ Church was, I think, maybe the second or third book I ever read. And what struck me as I read more and more was, you touched on this beautiful articulation of the kind of process eschatological vision earlier today. We've talked about it a bit, but I think something unique that you offered at the time for me in God Christ Church was this beautiful, hopeful picture of, justice and healing at the end of our lives. And I haven't always seen that everywhere else. I think there's kind of this, often in the description of at least objective immortality, there's something not satisfying, something not beautiful enough about that in many, of the articulations from other process theologians. And so I think you did something really special there and maybe a little different. And I was hoping you could talk about that a bit more.
Okay, to my mind, and we touched on it a little before. I don't know if you were in the room. When I think eschatology is about judgment, and judgment is salvation. Judgment is another word for salvation, because in God we will finally know as we are known. And then I thought, well, here's the problem of the million Marjories, because if God receives us in every moment of our lives, and each one of those moments is me, how many me's are there in God? Are there a million Marjories or something? Is there some kind of consolidation that makes us all of? Are we somehow ourselves all at once in God? I have no idea. But I do think, see, for me, there has to be this judgment, because if I'm going to think about justice, you cannot have justice without judgment. And you cannot have judgment without that judgment at the same time being salvation. And I already described how I think that works through we shall know as we are known and all that sort of stuff. So I had all this marvelous understanding of eschatology worked out. And in terms of just living in the love of God, why even talk about it? You can't possibly imagine it in a way that would give fullness to what that reality would finally be. Maybe Dante did a little bit in his Paradiso or something like that. Anyhow, it was Valentine's Day. I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm a dean of a school there. And I have this sense of my mother with me all day long. It was really weird. My mother had died a few years previous to that in Texas, as a matter of fact. And I'm talking to my daughter, Kathy, on the phone that night, and I said, Kathy, I felt my mom all day, almost like looking out my eyes or something. And she said, me too. Oh, I said, isn't that funny? That night I went to sleep, and I had the dream. My mother comes to me in the dream. Mom, I says, it's so great seeing you again. I've had feelings for you all day. She said, well, of course, dear, I've been here. Oh, really? So I said, and then I suddenly realized, here's my mother back from the dead. Mom, I said, my eschatology, is it true? And she says, oh, no, dear, it's nothing like that. And that was the end of the dream. And I woke up laughing my head off. I said, then it's something better. So I have all these images of eschatology, and at the same time I think there's this big joke. Here I am, Marjorie Suchocki, just a woman, and she makes up all these things about what happens after she's dead, or what's going on always in the life of God, because God so loved the world. And she's going to tell you what eschatology is like. What a laugh. and because you have to have a certain humility about your own theology, how could you possibly think up the way it really is? So you think up images of how it could be, and you know that it must be better.
Yes, it's at least as beautiful as the way you've described it. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I want you to know how much I've appreciated getting to talk to you. And while we have only hung out a few times, in my head, you've hung out with me quite a bit.
Imagine that.
And since you told a dream story, this might be a little awkward, but I will tell you the awkward Marjorie showing up in my dream story.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I remember that.
I was, the first time I was teaching process theology, and in my head, I'm like, I do this on the internet all the time. I'm good at this. But see, people that choose to listen to you and use their free time are different than those going in debt to get an A. They may not ultimately be animated in the same way people volunteering their time. And so he read part 5 of Process and Reality, and I'm just like, this is probably the greatest thing ever. Yeah. Half the class looks like, is he going to end? I'm like, I got it.
Is it over yet?
And then I've said, send in your questions for next time, right? And people are like, why are there multiple parts of concrescence? What's this? And I came in, and this is a seminary class, right? And I was like, y'all all ask really bad questions, and I was like, why are you in a process theology class if you don't even want to figure out how to, you're going to all be serving people in congregations and different nonprofits, and you're eventually going to ask yourself, what does God have to do with this? Where's God in all this? And then I'm going to say, go check my notes, and I was like, come on, this really matters. And I said, well, what is the most pressing question on your mind? And what did someone say? Basically what John said, evil and suffering, and is there justice? And I said, all right, next week, I'm going to be explaining Marjorie's eschatology to everyone in here. You'll be getting a PDF of the greatest hits from the end of evil in your email. And if you read that and don't think it's worth discussing, do not come, because class is going to feel like I'm preaching. Right? And so I was like, I'm going to raise the stakes, get them interested so they come in, to go. And I go to bed and I'm getting ready for that class. And then you showed up in my dream and you said, "No, Trip, it's okay if they're not that interested." and you're like talking me down, like, and I'd had myself worked up, and you're like, "No, it really is. It is, and they don't have to use any of this. God's going to meet them in the next moment regardless. You don't have to save Christianity for them. You don't even have to convince them God's a word worth using. It's above their pay grade to get rid of God, even if they get rid of the word." And you're like, and I was like, "I know, Margie, but like, don't you think?" And you're like, "Oh, I'm pretty sure we agree." I just take a deep breath. Like, and I just, so that I come in there and tell them that story, and they're like, "He lived in California a while. He's very woo-woo." So I was like, "Oh."
That's a great story. I would have said that.
I know. I was sitting there going like, "Y'all obviously don't think this is the greatest thing of all time like I do, so you're wrong." And though it technically affirms a multiplicity of different options.
Yes.
But subjectively, this is the best, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the pluralism is important, because how can any one of us actually know what these deep things of existence really are? What we are is a kaleidoscope of perspectives. And we, like, even in this study of the Tanakh and reading through the commentaries, so many different voices, so that one person doesn't have all the answers. It's like a kaleidoscope of many, and then God is in all of it. Maybe God is the kaleidoscope in which we all take. Anyhow, I appreciate that story. It's been nice talking to you. I had no idea you liked my work.
He's a big fan.
Big fan.
Wow, am I lucky?
The only other person he talks about that much is John Cobb, and something about making love and eye contact.
Well, where that came from, the first Summer Process Institute. I knew that it was not a Baptist theology class when Marjorie, explaining prayer, says, "If you want to capture the notion of process prayer and the way that God fully receives each moment, when there's mutual orgasm, you give a little prayer and say, 'You're welcome.'"
Yes. Did I actually say that?
Yes.
Well, of course I think that.
I don't know. I was like, "That's awesome," and I want you to know,
You stole it.
I've used it repeatedly, but and Alicia, my wife, was like, why do you say that? Don't do that when I'm in the room. So on our 10th anniversary, and at the appointed time, she goes, "Trip, could you give God a prayer?"
Are you praying, dear?
I was like, "Are you taunting me, or is that encouragement?" I hope you're ready to say you're welcome. Anyway. Well, that's an interesting end to a podcast. Never discussed romantic moments on an anniversary as a conclusion of a podcast, Marjorie.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
Okay, next time I won't bring it up.
Okay, well, you had the microphone off, right?
Awesome.
The end.